Well, welcome everybody to the Heritage Foundation. Delighted to have you here today for a very, very special event for a new book by Brian Garner. So I'll give him a brief introduction, and then I will actually leave the stage and let Brian come up and talk to you for a little bit. So Brian Garner is the founder and president of Law Pros, which provides seminars on clear writing, briefing, and editing for both lawyers and judges. Brian got his undergraduate and law degree from the University of Texas at Austin, and then clerked for Judge Thomas Rivley on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. After a brief stint in private practice, he returned to his alma mater as the director of the Oxford Center of Legal Lexicography. In 1990, Brian left the university to found his company, although he continues to teach at Southern Methodist University's Dedman School of Law, where he is the Distinguished Research Professor of Law. In 1995, Brian was named as the editor-in-chief of Black's Law Dictionary, which is, of course, familiar to all lawyers. He's the author of more than 24 books, including 2 books that he co-authored with the late Justice Antonin Scalia: Making Your Case, The Art of Persuading Judges in 2008, and Reading Law, The Interpretation of Legal Texts in 2012. His most recent book, Nino and Me, My Unusual Friendship with Justice Antonin Scalia, is a fond reminiscence of his experiences that he shared over the years with Justice Scalia, whom Brian describes accurately enough as a fellow snoot, although I will leave it to him to tell you what that term means. Please join me in welcoming Brian Garner.
Thank you. Thank you. Am I going to be all right without a microphone? Good. No, I will not. So I need to be over here. So it makes me happy. It makes me happy. That was one of Justice Scalia's favorite phrases. And occasionally, that makes me very unhappy. Elementary expressions of emotion, but he would frequently say that. It makes me happy. It makes me happy to be here to talk about Nino and me. Nino and I liked stools. I was going to use the stool. Stools appeal to us, Nino and me. Is a book about 3 things, principally. One is friendship. A second is literary collaboration. And a third is Justice Scalia, with a fair amount of legal philosophy thrown in. You know, when it comes to friendship, Samuel Johnson said that there are many accidents that must happen for the formation of a friendship, and I think that is particularly true. The traditional sense of friendship, of course, and I think we're losing it in modern culture, the idea of friendship, because the traditional view was you'd be very lucky to go through life with one friend, one true friend. If you have 2, that's an extraordinary life. Many people go through life without any close friends. And to go through life with 3 friends, I mean, that is an embarrassment of riches. But today, I mean, the idea of friendship is, how many friends do you have on Facebook? Well, I have 950. How many do you have? 1,250. And I unfriended someone yesterday, 1,249. And so I think we have lost the traditional notion of friendship. When you think about Horatio and Hamlet, for example, that's friendship. Not to say that I agree with Euripides. I think Euripides was clearly being hyperbolic when he said that one true friend is worth 100 relatives. That can't be true. But it's a book principally about friendship. Now, this is an unusual friendship, but most unlikely friendship. There were impediments. There were obstacles to the friendship. Some of them natural obstacles, and some of them artificial obstacles. Some of the pious people in Justice Scalia's life were suspicious of why he wanted to spend so much time with an apostate unbeliever. Some of the New Yorkers in Justice Scalia's life were puzzled by this interloping Texan. And some of the legal scholars in Justice Scalia's life thought, I came to realize later, and I think I'm glad I didn't even know this stuff, I think, for the most part, during his life. But some legal scholars were thinking, you could write a book with anybody. Why are you writing a book with Garner? You could write a book with me. So there were these obstacles. And then of course, there were misunderstandings. We had a couple of breakups early on. It was sort of a tumultuous friendship in the beginning. And I thought I would just write a book with a man. You know, we were going to write a book on rhetoric. Why? And of course, my impressions of Justice Scalia were mainly formed by the press. Very difficult man, I thought. I never thought I would love the man. Why would I love this man? Very difficult, curmudgeonly man, I thought. And so I tell the story of how this unlikely friendship formed and how it progressed. And it's part of the timeline involved is to show just how an unusual friendship, in this case a very particular one, how it formed and why it formed and what happened, because it was a lot of drama involved. Justice Scalia liked argument so much that he would inject a fair amount of tension and drama in almost every situation. So for the story of a literary collaboration, it's really unbelievably action-packed. Now, what I thought I would do is share with you a few passages from the book. And this is a book, but David Foster Wallace. The book is dedicated to David Foster Wallace. The friendship never would have occurred if it hadn't been for David Foster Wallace encouraging me to seek out Justice Scalia, because I was interviewing judges and lawyers around the country, and David, who was my friend, had written about me, and we had become friends, said, you must seek out Justice Scalia. His views on rhetoric are really very interesting. And so I did. And I was going to read to you a few passages from the book. The book is full of vignettes. Every vignette is intended to elucidate in some way Justice Scalia's character, what he was like as a person, what he was like as a human being, as a companion and as a friend. Not the personage. We all know the personage, Justice Scalia. So few really knew the person, the human being. And I wanted to evoke the man. And 6 months after, so I'm going to read to you a bit from the introduction, where I characterize Justice Scalia. I'm going to read to you a little passage called An Exuberant Phone Call, just because of the joy involved in that. And then I'm going to read to you a little passage called A Freudian Slip and Fall. And that sort of explains how the legal philosophy gets into the book, mostly through dialogue. There's a lot of dialogue. And of course, I've been heavily influenced by Samuel Johnson all my life, and James Boswell in this case. It's a Boswellian sort of account because Justice Scalia comes alive in the dialogue. But there are vignettes. There are vignettes about testing a friendship, about working through disagreements, about humor, about encouragement and personal cheerleading, about joy, about commiseration. David Foster Wallace dies. About empathy, something that probably many people don't associate with Justice Scalia. Forgiveness, very important concept to Justice Scalia. music, the lessons of childhood, and treasuring friendships. So, first, a little bit about the man. 6 months after Justice Scalia's death, my wife and I were in Amsterdam. We were staying at the Amsterdam Hilton, same place where John and Yoko had their famous bed-in. I suggested to Caroline, we should have a bed-in. Let's have a bed-in to protest. John and Yoko were protesting the Vietnam War. I wanted to protest Justice Scalia's death. And the press didn't show up. Surprisingly. But Caroline said to me, why don't you try to sum up Justice Scalia in one paragraph? And just write one paragraph summing up the man. And so that's what I did. And it ended up actually being the second paragraph of the book, summing up the man. The first paragraph goes like this. It's a one-sentence paragraph, and it goes like this. Antonin Scalia was a man of strong likes and dislikes. One was that he relished long paragraphs and recoiled from single-sentence ones. Paragraph. So that was the first paragraph. Then comes what ended up being broken up into several paragraphs, but this was actually one paragraph initially, and this was what I wrote in the Amsterdam Hilton in my little bed-in protest. He was at once conservative but nonconformist, temperamental but companionable, Epicurean but admiring of asceticism, passionate but duty-conscious, thoughtful but unremorseful, rotund but athletic, ultra-competitive but compassionate, serious but often impish. At turns he could be jovial or tetchy, demanding or forgiving, taciturn or talkative, curmudgeonly or resigned, pugnacious or agreeable, stubborn or acquiescent. With his expressive, almost perfectly symmetrical face, his high forehead, accentuated by hair neatly combed straight back, his ruddy cheeks that would crease into dimples when he grinned, his long philtrum above a protuberant lower lip, and the slightly cleft chin punctuating his squarish jaw, he was quick to smile when amused and predisposed to guffaw with unreserved gusto. At 5'9", he had a stocky frame with rounded shoulders, and he moved always with purpose, even determination. His burly, sun-spotted hands gesticulated with Sicilian flair. If something displeased him, his visceral reaction would almost instantly be clear to all present as a matter of body language before manifesting itself in words. He put a great deal of stock in a person's conversational skills. He appreciated good discussions and resented poor ones that wasted his time. He was a gifted raconteur whose mind was well stocked with pertinent stories and jokes, but he consciously avoided repeating any to listeners who had already heard them. He dreaded the idea of seeming trite and banal. He liked most things classical and detested most things newfangled. Upon the mere mention of the composer Edvard Grieg, he would burst into a boisterous rendition of In the Hall of the Mountain King, a rousing movement of Grieg's Peer Gynt. His taste in popular music, on the other hand, ran only as far as the Andrews Sisters. The Andrews Sisters' You Call Everybody Darling, 1948, and he felt impelled to leave a 2010 wedding reception when the band began playing something as rock and rolly as an early Beatles song. He liked unpretentious refinement and deplored the manners of what he called yabbers, especially the incorrect grasping of fork at table and the epidemic of men's wearing hats indoors, particularly at restaurants. I can't tell you how many restaurants we had to change our tables because there was a man in view wearing a hat, and that was intolerable. He was a proudly old-fashioned man who took pleasure upon the mention of the latest fad in declaring absolutely no knowledge of it. Yet with 9 children having entered various fields, including law, the clergy, the military, the humanities, and business, he was hardly out of touch. He well understood the more enduring features of American life. He was skeptical. By the way, we're now 20% of the way into the first paragraph. But you understand, he liked long paragraphs. That's part of the point of it. He was skeptical of people's motives, but moderately susceptible to flattery. Although his mind was suspicious, his heart was welcoming, and the latter won most close conflicts. He was an intellectual enfant terrible of the right, who relished teaching against the class. That's what he called it, teaching against the class. That is, affronting the complacent notions of politically committed people by pointing out uncomfortable truths incompatible with their ideas, especially if their ideas were left-leaning. His favorite rhetorical device was the reductio ad absurdum, and he was a relentless debater who could be defeated resoundingly only when he wasn't present. Bad press seemed to affect him not in the slightest. Never outwardly diffident, in private, he was an intellectual pugilist who would sometimes retreat when confronted by a knowledgeable opponent whom he trusted. He was prone to what one of his colleagues called summer thunderstorms, temperamental outbursts that would pass quickly, leaving no remnant. What he admired, he praised freely, but he never gave empty compliments. He reveled in words and knew their power, and his strong aesthetic sense flexed itself as much with language, even penmanship, as it did with music, architecture, and art. He had as many close female friends as male ones. He enjoyed the, quote, manly, end quote, activities of hunting, cigar smoking, and hearty eating and drinking. He was a trencherman. But he also knew his limits, disapproving gluttony and lauding those with the self-restraint to curb hedonistic pursuits. He liked bright-line distinctions and clear rules. He abhorred blurred lines and fuzzy indecisiveness. Adoring of his parents, he rebelled against his father, if he rebelled at all, by becoming an even more devout Roman Catholic at a time when his father was an unbeliever. He preferred a Latin Mass on Sunday and bristled at Masses featuring folk music. As a teenager in New York, he had been something of a heartthrob on a TV show about adolescent etiquette. In a way that he could never have imagined then, he later became an intellectual heartthrob to many. But despite all the beautiful law student devotees who sought him out for pictures and autographs at every public event, he was a husband of unwavering devotion with nothing but an amused chuckle and a signature for his young admirers. "Maureen knows all about my groupies," he'd say with a grin. He loved the routine of doing yard work alone and of playing poker regularly with friends. Those who loved him did so with fervor and devotion. Those inclined to loathe his ideas were more often than not disarmed, just as I'm disarmed at this moment, because, it's still hard to talk about. Where those who inclined to loathe his ideas were more often than not disarmed by how much, upon meeting him, they were drawn to him, and at how cogent and intelligent his ideas were when fairly presented. In perhaps the unlikeliest collaboration in the recent history of legal writing, we wrote 2 books together. We appeared on stage together more than 40 times, teaching, exhorting, admonishing, and trading jibes. We dined and traveled together. His book is my remembrance of him and of our time together. When he died in February 2016, we had before us 3 unbegun or barely begun projects. A series of 10 or so videotaped interviews in which I would ask him everything about his life and philosophy, to be published posthumously, we agreed, in book form. A 3-volume collection of his speeches, which I had agreed to edit and had already sorted for him into 3 categories: law, religion, and civics. And a 2-night engagement at Carnegie Hall to be called An Evening with Justice Antonin Scalia, in which he agreed to a pedagogical interview before a live audience. He would answer any question I might put to him in a 2-hour presentation. Profits would be quietly given to legal aid because fundraising was not allowed. The gift would not be publicized in advance. Having begun our performances At the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts in 2008, we were both eager to book Carnegie Hall. Brian, he told me when I agreed to edit his speeches, the important thing is that we continue working together. This memoir is undertaken in the spirit of making good on that commitment. Although death ends a life, it doesn't end a friendship. End of paragraph. So that was my attempt to sort of sum up the man. Of course, the speeches have now come out in a wonderful volume edited by his son, Christopher Scalia, and it's called Scalia Speaks. It's an excellent book. Smaller than what we were planning in the 3 volumes, but just first rate. So, I thought I would share with you, I think I'm going to share with you the exuberant phone call, just to illustrate the joy that he would sometimes express. And then the Freudian slip and fall, because you get a little bit of legal philosophy in that passage. And then we're going to take questions at the end. I could possibly, if we have time, share with you the very dramatic sort of near breakup. It was a breakup and reconciliation, which was quite extraordinary. But first, let's hear the exuberant phone call. So we wrote a book called Making Your Case. Now you're watching photographs of us revolving on the screen. That's actually the 2 of us on a sampan, probably a little less than 2 weeks before he died. When we returned to the United States, it was 8 days before he died. We said goodbye, and he was just fine. So his death did come as quite a shock to me and to, I think, everybody close to Justice Scalia. But let's go back in time to 2009. We had just published the year before Making Your Case, and I received a phone call. So this section is called An Exuberant Phone Call. Not long after, as I was sitting in my office in Dallas, I received a phone call from Justice Scalia. Brian, people are listening. People are really listening. He sounded giddy. What do you mean? You know how we say in Making Your Case not to use up all your time at oral argument, but to sit down early if there's nothing useful that's left to say? Yes. It happened this morning in our court. Both sides did it. The justices couldn't believe it. We got out 20 minutes early. That's amazing, I said. I haven't seen it in nearly 30 years on the bench, and certainly not in the 25 years I've been here at the court. Wow, they got it from our book, Brian. Of course they did, I said. They got it from our book. That's very typical of him, by the way, to repeat something for great emphasis. They got it from our book. They're paying attention. The petitioners did it, and the justices all glanced at each other, and then the respondents did it, and we were stunned. We were all buzzing about it afterward in the robing room. Did your colleagues acknowledge that it was because of our book? Well, no. Did you tell them? Of course not. I didn't want to claim credit. It would have been immodest, but you and I know. That's why the first thing I did in getting back here to Chambers was call you. You and I know. Yes, we do, Nino. Congratulations. That's very typical of the kind of just sheer exuberance that he would sometimes share with the people close to him. Now, the Freudian slip and fall that I'm going to share with you has to do with our wedding. Justice Scalia traveled to Providence, Rhode Island to marry Caroline and me in 2010. And it was a wonderful wedding at one of those grand estates it's actually in Newport, was where we were married. But this happened in Providence the morning of the wedding, and it was rather dramatic. It goes like this. A lot of dialogue, but I wanted to bring the spirit of Justice Scalia and what he was like as a man. This is called Freudian slip and fall. The next morning, Justice Scalia went to a Latin Mass we'd found for him in Providence. Then we met in the lobby of the Westin to have lunch in the historic neighborhood known as Federal Hill. It was a beautiful sunny day. The marshals took us to De Pasquale Plaza for open-air dining at Constantino's Venda Ravioli. We were joined by my father and his companion, Mary Irene, a Santa Fe artist. The day before, my father had missed the rehearsal dinner because of a kidney stone. On a layover in Denver, en route from San Francisco, he and Mary Irene had taken an ambulance from the airport to the local hospital, where he was in excruciating pain until he passed the stone. Over lunch, the two of them recounted the traumatic events of the past 24 hours. Probably casting about for something interesting to say to Justice Scalia, my father asked whether Bush v. Gore was a hard decision. Not really. Remember, it was Al Gore who took the case to the courts. The real question was who was to decide, a highly partisan Florida Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court. But isn't the Supreme Court highly partisan these days? My father persisted. It looks that way, said Justice Scalia, which is unfortunate, but in fact we're not. It's just that presidents appoint justices with a particular judicial philosophy, which ends up looking as if the votes go down party lines. That's misleading. In any event, most of our cases aren't political at all. We're doing mundane lawyer work involving patents and regulatory authority. As we left the restaurant, we said goodbye to my father and Mary Irene, who headed toward a taxi line. Walking on the cobblestones to the promenade, I spotted the marshals at the car waiting on Atwell's Avenue. I said to him joshingly, "Nino, you're so mollycoddled. You have these marshals taking care of you. Look at them. They make everything so easy for you. I'll bet you've forgotten what it's like to travel as a normal person." "Not at all. I'm aware of what's going on. I'm not like Warren Burger. I'm not like Warren Burger, who was also known by insiders as Mr. Magoo." "He wasn't aware? Are you kidding? He was a real Mr. Magoo. You know the cartoon, right?" "I remember." The marshals would lead Burger around, and he was unaware of everything that wasn't 3 feet in front of him. He did a brief imitation of the Mr. Magoo character. "Really?" "Yeah." Justice Scalia did a silly walk as if holding a cane, squinting as he went. He would bumble along, do-do-do-do-do, oblivious of everything. We laughed, and then he resumed his normal gait. Justice Scalia started to get into the marshal's car, and a marshal was with him at the door. As I was going behind the car to get in the other side, Justice Scalia fell to the ground and rolled. He was utterly silent. I saw him on the ground and ran over to help him. It seems he hadn't gotten entirely onto the seat when he'd begun turning, and he slid out instead of in. Our waiter, who had been lingering at a distance as if starstruck, rushed toward him at the same time as I, but didn't touch him. With the marshal, I pulled him up into the back seat. The marshals seemed embarrassed. "You okay, Nino?" "I'm okay. I guess I wasn't very careful." I ran around to get into the back seat with him. "No broken bones? Check your knees, your wrists, your fingers." I gently squeezed both of his knees to make sure he was in no pain. "No broken bones. I think I'm probably just bruised." "You're sure?" "I'm okay. My elbow hurts." "Give me your arm." But as I massaged his left elbow, he jerked it away. "Ow!" "Let's just be sure you didn't dislocate your elbow or shoulder." "I'm fine. Let's go back to the hotel." "Let me feel your other elbow and shoulder." "I didn't fall on that side, damn it." "Should we go see a doctor?" "No, I'll be bruised. I'm sure it'll be sore for a few days." "You're really lucky." "I guess so, damn it. My elbow's going to hurt for the next week." "I'll give you some ibuprofen when we get to the hotel. That'll keep the swelling down," I said. "Okay, you sure? What?" Ibuprofen. It's Advil. He didn't know what Advil was. Or he knew what Advil was. He didn't know what ibuprofen was. It's Advil. Maybe we should ask your doctor whether it's compatible with whatever other medicines you take. It'll be fine. I don't take many medications. Nothing incompatible with Advil? Nah. Okay. I'll give you 2 Advils as soon as we get to the hotel. I'm a tough guy, Justice Scalia said, grinning in the back seat. I feel bad about the conversation we were having beforehand, I said. How so? About your being mollycoddled by the marshals, and then your Mr. Magoo reference to Chief Justice Berger. What of it? I don't know if you've read Sigmund Freud's The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, but he connects things like that. He might say that my kidding you about being pampered caused you subconsciously to be a little more footloose and incautious. Ah, baloney. Well, I'm glad you're okay. You're going to have a sore elbow, all right. I've had worse, he said, stretching out his arm. At least I'm in good enough shape to get you hitched tonight. You're absolutely sure I have the authority? Yes, I'll even show you the legislative resolution granting it specifically to you for our particular wedding. Did I tell you that some Rhode Island legislator made a speech in opposition? What? Yeah. A Republican started bloviating about how they have plenty of good, solid Rhode Island judges to perform weddings, and why should we need a federal judge to come do this one? He laughed. Did someone explain why I would be coming here to do it? That we're friends and co-authors? I think so. The objections didn't last long. Let's run by my room so I can show you the resolution. Nah, show me later. I trust you. Let's go to my room. Walking through the lobby toward the elevator, I promised the bellman $20 if he would get 2 ice packs into my hands quickly. One of the marshals said he'd wait behind and bring them to the room. We got on the elevator. Nino, let's stop at our suite first. We've got to get your Advil anyway. And if I don't show you the certificate now, you'll never see it. Later will never come. Oh, okay. Soon we were at my door. Hey, great suite, he said as we entered my room. Did you know they put a bottle of Campari in my room? Of course, Line did that, I said, handing him the Advil tablets and a bottle of water. Then I showed him the fancy certificate. Pretty impressive. I'm endowed with full authority. I am, after all, a Supreme Justice. That was one of his favorite expressions as well. You are indeed, Nino. Let's go over to your suite, relax a bit, and get those cold compresses on your elbow. I'll get you some sparkling water. Sounds perfect. I'll put my feet up. My right knee's a little sore, too. We walked to his room. I helped him get his shoes off. At this point in his life, age 74, bending over to tie or untie shoes required a bit of effort. To get situated, he stripped down to his undershirt and boxer shorts. I put sofa pillows under his feet and got him lying back on the couch. A knock came at the door. The ice packs had arrived in less than 3 minutes. All was well. I felt as if I had averted what could have been. I felt as if we had averted what could have been a disaster. Although I might have left him alone, I decided to stay with him to make sure he was feeling all right. Soon he seemed to have forgotten about his elbow. I've been thinking about reading law, I said. Always working, aren't you? He said, lying back. For goodness sakes, you're getting married tonight. Well, we have this time together. We may as well use it, if you say so. In the literature, I was purposely actually trying to distract him a little bit. In the literature, I said, some scholars are using the term legislative free riding. If the legislature can't pass legislation, they just rely on the courts to patch up their messes. That's right. They pass more and more of this junk. Courts shouldn't bail them out. Courts should either enforce the statutes as written or declare that they have no discernible meaning and hold them invalid. I wish we did that more. I said, wouldn't you agree that we have a syndrome right now, a syndrome of courts not doing that and therefore encouraging more and more slipshod lawmaking? I would agree. It should stop. I handed him a Campari and soda, light on the Campari and heavy on the soda. Well, I said, I've written a couple of paragraphs for the intro. See what you think. I will. When can I get a new draft? It's waiting for you back in chambers. You manage that? I imagine you've been busy this week. I don't know how you do it all. Well, I love what I do, just like you. We're lucky that way, he said. Our conversation returned to Congress. We should have a moratorium on new laws for a while, Justice Scalia said. What would happen, I asked, if Congress passed no laws for 5 years, just had occasional hearings to keep themselves busy? That would be excellent, he said. Our polity would flourish. And what if, instead of the congressional staffers who work with might and main to produce legislative history, we had grammatically rigorous editors to proofread and refine the statutes that are passed? I asked. People like you? There wouldn't be enough. I disagreed. Oh, Nino, there are lots of highly qualified editors out there, highly skilled in grammar. They could work wonders, and the judges' jobs would get a little easier. They sure would. If they're textualist judges, if they're non-textualists, they're not paying too much attention to the enacted words anyway. Right. Of course, in the popular mind, textualists are pretty badly misunderstood. I agree, Justice Scalia said, but why do you say so? I said, all the reporting is just about bottom-line results, especially when it comes to constitutional litigation. You're either for gay rights or else you're homophobic. The liberal press, I suppose that's right, he said. It's as if it's commonly understood that judges get to adopt whatever policy pleases them, I said. Most people don't grasp the separation of powers problem. I see what you mean, Justice Scalia said. So my liberal colleagues have convinced people that the court will create new policies with hardly any restraint. Sort of, I answered. If a textualist judge refuses to gloss a statute in some newfangled progressive way on the principal ground that that's not what judges are supposed to do, it never gets reported that way. That was the point of a speech I gave, Justice Scalia said, at the National Press Club. I answered, I remember that speech, but I thought you were making a different point, that the statutory wordings at issue are never reported in the press. Right. But you weren't emphasizing that under the separation of powers doctrine, the judicial power doesn't extend to amending the Constitution. By the way, this whole conversation is taking place while his feet are up and he's got a cold compress on his elbow, of course. Look it. That was a favorite expression of his whenever he was impatient. Look it. I've said that dozens of times in various ways. But those who oppose you have now conditioned the American public to think otherwise. Well, if that's true, it's very disappointing. And your principled approach to judging is called a fig leaf for conservative results. Ridiculous, said Justice Scalia. I know, but I think we can help set matters straight in the introduction to reading law. The intro's already too damn long, he said. No, it's not, Nino. I found a quotation from George Washington saying that the prosperity and endurance of our nation depends on proper interpretation of the laws. I've never seen that. You found it? Yes, you're gonna love it. We must lay out a cogent argument in the intro before we get into any of the details of how to do textualism properly. I'll have a look at it when I get back, he said, closing his eyes. Again and again, I replayed in my mind Justice Scalia's fall. The moment it occurred, I decided never again when outside Washington to leave it to marshals, whom he didn't know well, to see that he got safely into a car. Of course, the marshals were also concerned about external threats to safety, so it was understandable that their attention might not be focused entirely on the justice himself as opposed to the immediate environment. In any event, unless a marshal stayed close to him, I would stand with him at his door to prevent a fall. From my wedding day on, that became my usual practice. It was called the 60% rule. He would say, "Don't baby me." I would say, "Satisfy the 60% rule." "What are you talking about?" "You must have 60% of your buttocks on the seat before I leave this spot." And so we had the 60% rule, and we joked about it, of course, throughout China. I would never leave his side when he was getting in the car until he had satisfied the 60% rule. So, there's that part. I'll read you one last thing. It's shorter, I promise. A shorter passage. a little bit at the end, and it's about friendship, and it's about the end. Justice Scalia died 2 days later in his sleep on the first night of the hunting trip. The next morning, he didn't show up for breakfast. It was a wrenching moment when I found out, and the wrenching moment turned into a wrenching month and a wrenching year. Life hasn't been the same. What began as an interview request prompted by David Foster Wallace evolved into a joint writing project. Back in 2006, I thought it would be a fascinating diversion. But soon my life had been transformed. Justice Scalia had befriended me, and his loss has caused a more profound hurt than I could have imagined. Of course, loss is a familiar story. Someone you love and cherish is there one moment and gone the next. As Gertrude, Hamlet's mother, says callously to her son about her late husband's death, "Thou knowest 'tis common, all that lives must die, passing through nature to eternity." "Aye, madam," says Hamlet, "it is common." But hurts of this kind are always particular. I miss him terribly. I lost a co-author, an adoptive uncle, and a dear friend I never expected to make. Having reached midlife by 2006, I never thought I'd strike up a new friendship that would alter the course of my life, especially when all I sought initially was a videotaped interview with a person of great eminence, and the interview itself seemed unattainable. The closeness that developed between us surely took us both quite by surprise. We had conversations that only the two of us could have, Nino and me. I can't have those conversations anymore with anyone. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Ryan, why don't I give this to you,
Okay.
and you can go sit in the chair.
Thank you.
Which, sorry, I didn't have that for you before. And I will open it up to people with questions. I would ask you to identify yourself and then keep it short, no speeches, and end it with a question. Yes, let's go right over here. Hold on, you got a microphone coming your way.
Hello, thank you for writing the book. It's on my list of things to get done, to write a book. I'm questioning, how many years did it take you to compose this book?
Well, I started the book about 2 months after Justice Scalia died. It took me 18 months to write the book, and it was a labor of love. I mean, you know, with both of the books that he and I wrote, we did over 200 drafts, and I did over 200 drafts of this book. And it was a complicated book to research and write, because I had to do everything from, well, I first of all assembled a chronology of relevant events, something that litigators are well familiar with, and I was trained as a litigator. But every important email, I had to look at emails, I had to look at letters, handwritten notes, tape recordings that he and I guess they were videotape recordings that he had and I had made together. And what else? YouTube videos. Credit card receipts, where we were, when we, and then it was very interesting as I would look at the emails. It was very easy to recall the conversations that accompanied those, and so it was 18 months in the making.
Did you do it on a microphone, or did you put a yellow pen?
No, I handwrite almost everything. I tell the story about how I broke my left arm. I broke my humerus in 2011 in an ice storm in Dallas. Justice Scalia played a big role in my recovery, because for 2 years I had a curled up, crippled left hand. I mean, this is a minor miracle, and I attribute it to a fair degree to Justice Scalia's helping me find the very best doctor in the nation, Thomas Brushart, at Johns Hopkins to do the surgery. One of only 3 or 4 people in the world who could do this surgery. And anyway, ever since then, I've handwritten almost everything. Is there anyone else?
Other questions? Let me ask you, actually. So in the book, you talk about several times in which, I mean, obviously he had met many admirers, but periodically he would come upon people who were not so great admirers and who would say little barbs or challenge him in some way. How would he typically react in those sorts of situations?
Well, right before our final trip to Asia, this actually happened in a pharmacy. There was a man who walked up and said the most scurrilous thing to him, and he was gracious about it. He was a man really unaffected by criticism. I've never seen anyone so unconcerned with negative comments. What happened was the man came up in CVS pharmacy, "Is that Justice Scalia? Is that Justice Scalia?" And we had two marshals with us, and I nodded that it was. And he said, "I just want to shake the hand." And he was being pretty loud about it. "I just want to shake the hand." And Justice Scalia came over. I said, "I think he wants to shake your hand." And right as Justice Scalia put his hand in this man's hand, the man shouted, "Of the biggest bigot on the U.S. Supreme Court." And I said, "Get away from here." And the marshals kind of took him down the aisle. And Justice Scalia turned and paid. And I said, "Nino, I'm really sorry about that." He said, I didn't even hear the man. I think he did, but I didn't even hear the man. And he was unconcerned. At times, I would get my feelings hurt. I would get my feelings hurt on his behalf over something that was reported in the press. And he would say, "Oh, forgive them. That's just what they do. Forgive them." He was very unconcerned. Yes.
And I only read the introduction last night after I picked up the book. One of the things that both practitioners, I think, and obviously you as his friend knew was about Justice Scalia's great humor. And I've been blessed enough to have had a couple of occasions to argue before the court. I read making your case before the first one, but I still lost 9-0, I'm afraid.
Oh, dear.
Yes, well, I won the second one. But in any case, the point being, my first thought after hearing of his passing was that oral argument would not be nearly as much fun with his loss. Did you ever have a chance to see him on the bench? And if you did, have you been there since, just by way of comparison?
I have not been there since. I'm sure I will, and I'm sure it'll be a little bit difficult. Even coming to Washington is a little bit difficult for me. It's so different because and I knew the day would pass when I would be getting together with Justice Scalia and taking a car to the U.S. Supreme Court and spending time together. We would have endless jam sessions together on our writing projects, and it was so much fun. And it did seem as if he would frequently just drop everything to have dinner together. And sometimes we once had, 4 dinners in a row. So that has changed. I knew it would come to an end at some point, but he and I had agreed whoever died first, whichever one of us died first, would receive a tribute from the other. And it frequently occurred to me, as I think we all think about, when our time comes, I might have died first. But I suspected that there would be a day when I would be in Washington and he wouldn't be around anymore, and it is very different. I'm sure going to the court will be quite different. There was a laughometer index at the Supreme Court. He got the most laughs with his questions, by far, I think, double anyone else than the other justices. And so yes, I think oral argument is going to be quite different without him.
Let me ask you one more question before we finish up, just because such a great vignette in your book, and I saw you had a picture of it. I see you spent an evening with Justice Scalia and Francis Ford Coppola. What was that like? That must have been fun.
It was great. Justice Scalia's favorite movie was the Coppola movie. I'm blanking out on
Godfather
it.
1
The
and 2.
Godfather, yes. The Godfather 1 and 2. And I think he especially liked Godfather 2, but Godfather 1 and 2. And so it was quite something getting together with Coppola. Coppola was, however, I would say, suspicious, a little bit reticent, a little bit. He was assuming that he wouldn't probably get on with Justice Scalia. I just had that sense. But in fact, the ice was broken once they started talking about growing up in New York, and they got along. They got along well. But early on in the conversation, one thing I do remember is there was some talk about global warming, and I think Coppola was suggesting that Justice Scalia was a denier about global warming, and Justice Scalia said, "Well, how many trillions of dollars are you willing to spend over the next 50 years to affect the temperature of the planet by half a degree? How many? What are you willing to do?" And that was his view, which I think had to do with economics more than whether the planet is actually growing warmer and whether there's climate change. I think he was not a denier of that.
I'm sure they turned the conversation back to Michael Corleone after that. Please join me in thanking Brian Garner for being here.